Hello, my name is Dr. Artie Storè, and I would like to welcome you to the first of what I hope are many fruitful and exciting discussions introducing you to the world of art history. I am currently Professor Emeritus at the esteemed College State University, and before that I had the great pleasure of teaching and mentoring your art history teacher. He has informed me of your current studies, and I suggested I come here and discuss with you my interest in the arts of migratory peoples. Now, when talking about the art of migratory peoples, we should at first, of course, begin to discuss who these migratory peoples actually were. The migratory peoples are the peoples that you might call barbarians, but we refer to them as migratory because of their migrations throughout Western Europe. Many of these Western movements stopped, and they adopted the local customs of the areas they now inhabited. These local customs, of course, primarily came from the Roman Empire and from Christianity. If we look at this map here to the right, we see some of these movements being tracked here. As you can see, many of them came from Eastern Europe and from Central Asia, and were pushed ever westward. Much of this Western movement was, of course, created by the Huns. The Huns, being a Central Asian migratory people as well, pushed the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths ever westward and into and through Rome. Eventually, many of these migrations stopped and formed some of the early tribes that we see on the map here to the right. Now, in this lecture, I'd like to speak to you today about some of these kingdoms, primarily the early Frankish kingdom of the Merovingians, before moving further north to talk about the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, and the Norse. In a later lecture, we will discuss the Frankish kingdoms under one of their great early rulers, Charlemagne. But first, let's go ahead and look at some of these Merovingian works, shall we? Let's. The Merovingians were Franks. They migrated westward from what is now Belgium into northern Gaul, and they took the name from Merovich, grandfather of Clovis I, who brought the Frankish tribes together during his rule from 481 to 511. Clovis famously converted to Christianity on Christmas Day in 496, when 3,000 Franks were baptized alongside their king. At this point in history, conversion to Christianity was less a personal choice than a social one. These Germanic peoples also brought art forms with them that were primarily portable: weaving, metalwork, jewelry, wood carving. Metalwork has, of course, an intrinsic value, as these works are often made of gold or silver, and many are inlaid with precious stones. Most knowledge that we have of this jewelry comes from jewelry uncovered in graves of kings and queens, and so on. The men and women wore earrings, necklaces, rings, bracelets, leather belts, and other such accoutrements. In 1959, a royal tomb was unearthed, and this, we believe, is a tomb of Erigund or Erigunda, and in it was found a stone sarcophagus, which seems to have been undisturbed since her burial sometime in 580 or 590. Not long after these dates, the Merovingians, it appeared, stopped practice of burying items with the dead, and instead donating those items to the church. So let us now move to the island that became home to another of these migratory peoples, the Angles, which of course we get the name England. Much as the Goths had moved westward from Central Europe, so too did the Angles and the Saxons, both Germanic groups from northern Europe who moved across the North Sea to a Roman Britain unprepared for such invasions. Over 200,000 mostly men came, killing most of the native population, taking their women and their land, and beginning the creation of a new kingdom that would last for hundreds of years. As in Merovingian France, these rulers were buried in massive graves with great riches. In 1939, archaeologists uncovered one such burial mound at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England. Hoo is an Anglo-Saxon word meaning headland or promontory. Most probably, this Hoo represented the burial of a 7th century king named Raedwald, who died around 625 CE. And he was buried in a ship not sent out to sea, but buried underground with jewels. And in it were found many such jewels and luxury goods, including a belt buckle made of gold, 10 silver bowls, a silver plate with the stamp of the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I, who ruled during the end of the 5th century and early 6th century, and 2 silver spoons with the names of Salos and Paulos inscribed upon them, these of course being the names that we commonly give to Saul and Paul. These objects indicate that these Germanic peoples were in contact with and trading with Mediterranean and Byzantine cultures. The names on those 2 spoons, Saul and Paul, actually reference the same individual, St. Paul, who converted from Judaism and became one of the fathers of the early Christian church. This story of conversion may play an important role in the life of King Raedwald, much as it did in the life of Clovis, king of France, some 100 years earlier. If we look at this Angle art, we see a style that we often refer to as animal style, due to the reoccurrence of animal motifs among the intricate interlaced design. This intricate animal style covers this large belt buckle that we see here from Sutton Hoo. In it, we see 2 interlaced biting snakes, and if I highlight these areas here, you see their heads appearing here and here. The stud is then attached to the buckle proper, which is also decorated with serpent and eagle motifs. In many ways, these peoples have an overriding interest in decoration with abstract design, incorporating animal forms. We will see this again and again, especially in one of the most highly acclaimed works from the Sutton Hoo burial. It is this work, featuring gold, enamel, ivory, and garnet. The ivory does not survive. It represents the backing and has been replaced. Much of this work features cloisonné jewelry work. Now, as I've been informed, you've already studied cloisonné, and cloisonné jewelry, of course, being jewelry, gems, encased in gold. As we see here, heraldic images adorn the main portion. Each has its own unique character and indicates that they were probably had their own unique source. The one in the lower left and the right has connections going very far, indeed, in time and in place. And if you're not sure where you've seen these before, I have a reminder. Here we see both a close-up from the Sutton Hoo purse cover, as well as a scene from the Queen's Lyre from the Royal Cemetery of Ur from the Sumerian period, some 2,000 500 years prior. This figure of a man, surrounded by animals, is a common one that we get from the Orient, and we see migrating through Europe and into the Isle of England. Looking back at this, we do see, of course, more complex interlaced designs in the upper portions, indicating that these are more recent origin. In the center, the bodies of those fighting animals have been elongated to create the borders around the pattern. In the bottom, we have eagle motifs. Again, we see these as common in the works of migratory peoples, interacting or attacking, perhaps, the ducks beneath them. Notice the intricacy with which the eagle beaks curve around and help to form the concavity of the duck beaks. The outer upper designs are entirely ornamental and show no use of the animal style. Pure interlace. In one of my many trips to the British Museum, I took this photograph here, which displays some of the Sutton Hoo metalwork from the British Museum, showing a possible imagining of King Raedwald. At this point, I'd like to turn to another migratory people, the Norse. As we saw with the Sutton Hoo burial, shipbuilding was a practice of many of these migratory peoples, and possibly the most famous of these groups were the Vikings. The Northmen, or as they became known, the Norsemen, and as such eventually Norway, travelled throughout Western and Northern Europe, along its coast, and down many of its rivers, attacking and pillaging towns and cities for centuries. As they did so, they were said in their language to go a Viking, and hence our name, Viking. Many of the centralized governments that would emerge in Europe in the High Middle Ages did so as a result of to combat these Viking excursions into the mainland. The intersection of animal style and interlaced pattern in this decorated end of a rug post from a buried Viking ship at Osberg in southern Norway shows again that the animal style is in frequent use among these migratory peoples, and indeed seems to last longer here in the Viking art than anywhere else. This is the Osberg ship burial ship. We have it in its entirety, and we see that it's not a raiding vessel, as common to the Vikings, but rather a pleasure craft for sailing in calm waters. It's built entirely of oak, about 75 feet long and 15 feet wide, featuring 15 pairs of oar holes, so for perhaps about 30 people rowing. Burial of the ship happened around 830, but the ship itself is probably older. It was excavated in 1904, and we have the remains of 2 women who were buried within, and the skeletons of at least 10 horses. Recent analysis has pointed the date of the burial to about 834. One of these women might be Queen Asa, wife of King Gudrid the Magnificent, because, of course, only a royal would have had the resources to commission objects of such richness that we find in the ship. Unlike Sutton Hoo, the metalwork and jewelry is all gone, presumably stolen by grave robbers, but we do have a number of very lovely posts carved in the animal style, as I showed you previously. 5 of these wood posts we found, decorated with snarling monsters and animal and interlaced patterns on their heads and faces, were found within the ship. Their actual function is unknown, but there does exist the possibility that they were carried in procession or for some other ritual purpose. The heads are surprisingly naturalistic, with teeth, gums, and nostrils. The interlaced designs on the body and head have been adapted, as you see, to fit the curves of the head. Now I'd like to turn to the book arts and the peoples known as the Hiberno-Saxons. The Irish were the spiritual and cultural leaders throughout the Middle Ages. Ireland was called Hibernia to the Romans, but it had never been part of the Roman Empire. Missionaries brought Christianity into Ireland, found a welcoming response, however. The Irish, though, had adapted the essentially urban Roman church structure into one of monasticism, following the traditions of monasteries in England, Egypt, and the Near East. These Irish monasteries became centers of learning, and each monastery became an artistic center as well. While illustrating biblical events, as earlier works, such as the Paris Psalter, held little interest for Irish monks, they spent a great time and effort on decorative embellishments. Again, although here we now are transversing into two-dimensional work, we see intricate embellishment being the main primary interest for these peoples. And these embellishments took two principal forms. One was the carpet page, and the other the evangelist page. There was a third style, which we'll look at later, called the incipit, which would highlight the initial words on a text. Evangelist pages are so named because they depict the symbol of the evangelist taken from imagery in early Christian manuscripts, and they were adapted to the ornamental style of Saxon art, hence why we refer to these works as Hiberno-Saxon. The four symbols of the evangelists are Matthew, the man, Saint Mark, the lion, Saint Luke, the ox, and Saint John, the eagle. I'd like to begin by discussing Saint Matthew. One of the earliest surviving books from this period is the Book of Durrow, dating to the 7th century, possibly begun in the island of Ionia, off the western coast of Scotland, or perhaps in Lindisfarne in northern England. At some point, it was probably taken to Durrow, either during its creation or possibly shortly after its finishing, as a result of Viking raids in those areas. The ornamental interlay style, common to Saxon art, animates this armless figure of Matthew here. The checkerboard pattern of the robes has connections to cloisonné work in some of the Sutton Hoo jewellery pieces. And like the preciousness of those metal works, the message of St. Matthew is just as precious. Here, of course, the man becomes the jewellery. Unlike the Book of Durrow, we know quite a bit about this next book, the Lindisfarne Gospels. There is a note at the end of a manuscript, many manuscripts, called a colophon, and the Lindisfarne Gospels contains one. It's written by a monk named Aldred that detailed all he knew about its creation. The scribe of this work was a bishop named Eadfrith, who presumably also painted the illuminations. Only the most senior monks would have been charged and trusted to copy sacred books. It was bound by his successor, Bishop Ethwald. A work such as this would have been extraordinarily expensive and laborious. 300 calfskins were used to make the vellum, and the pigments came from lands as far away as the Orient. Also of note is the development of the Hiberno-Saxon style. So let's compare this to the earlier work. Here, of course, you can see the change from St. Matthew as jewellery in the Book of Durrow to an individual in the Lindisfarne Gospels. But where exactly does the image for Matthew from the Lindisfarne Gospels come from? Well, probably this work here. This comes from the Codex Amiantus. The abbot of Jarrow, near Lindisfarne, is reported to have returned from a trip to Rome at the end of the 7th century with a host of manuscripts, including this one, and it's probable that the artists at Jarrow used these illuminations as models. We can see that in this illumination, the figure has attempted to be depicted with depth, and objects such as the cupboard presented in an oblique angle to create the illusion of depth. The cushion under which Ezra sits seems to be depressed by the weight of the prophet. So it's possible that Eadfrith, the illuminator of the Lindisfarne Gospels, used the same Roman manuscript as the source of his inspiration. Eadfrith, however, incorporated into this source the Hiberno-Saxon model more completely, playing with the more complementary colours, patterns, and flattenings of forms. The same rigidness that enlivens these figures exists at the heart of what might be the greatest image in the illuminated manuscripts, the so-called carpet pages. The illuminator has also included a figure in the background of this work, peeping out from behind curtains, not long enough to actually contain him. This figure has been of some debate. Some have identified him as Christ, offering inspiration to Matthew, but also as Moses, who sees the passing of his book, the Old Testament, now closed, with the New Testament, opening up the message of Christ. The carpet pages, as I mentioned, are not quite like the evangelist pages. They are, as we see here, entirely decorative. Carpet pages such as this one from the Lindisfarne Gospels would have been undertakings of enormous complexity. The illuminator would have used compasses and rulers to mark the page and create the underlying symmetry, and then begun to fill out the larger and smaller motifs in ink and pigment. As we see here, with the evangelist page, there's a stiff and rigid grid that underlies the work, and the organic and geometric shapes that dominate this work are kept separate and distinct. If we zoom in, we can see some of these motifs more clearly. Here, we can see how all the lines end up turning in to be some part, usually ambiguous, of an animal. Notice the ends of the scrollwork all have mouths and eyes, or some other beak or foot-like function. So these carpet pages function in much the same way as the ambulatories of stupas or the mandalas of Hindu temples. It is only through intense thought and meditation that we can enter into the world of the carpet page. The page's complexity forces our mind toward the divine, and thus works in the same respect as the labyrinths of late medieval cathedrals, which we will get to in a later lecture. The Hiberno-Saxon style reaches its climax 100 years after the Lindisfarne Gospels in a book called the Book of Kells. Begun on the island of Ionia around the end of the 8th century, but housed at Kells from the 9th to the 17th. Many of the pages reflect the influences and the transmission of styles from Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. This particular page that I'm showing is from the incipit, and is the so-called Chi Rho iota page from the book of Matthew. Now, much of the rest of this gospel would appear like this, in a simpler, yet still visually stunning way. So, I'd like you to imagine reading from this book, although rarely actually would books like these have actually been read. These were ritual objects, kept in what's called the sacristy, a room for other sacred objects of Mass, and not in a monastery's library. So imagine reading this text and then turning the page to come to the next portion of the Gospel, and it erupts in both religious meaning, the birth of Christ, as well as visual. It would be a wonderful, glorious image that shows the birth of Christ. I'd like you to compare this to the Book of Kells and the Ilia Lindisfarne Gospels. In the Lindisfarne Gospels on the left, we see less reliance on the rigidity and underlying structure. Here, the animal style of interlace spreads out in a unique and organic way in this Chi-Rho iota page that we don't see in any other books in the Hiberno-Saxon tradition. The illuminator has inserted numerous pictorial and symbolic references to Christ, such as the fish, and of course the Greek word for fish is ichthus. This was seen as an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God the Saviour. We also see symbols of moths, which would have been symbols of rebirth, crosses, which are inscribed with the Eucharist wafer, and even down at the bottom, we find cats pouncing on mice, eating a Eucharist wafer. This could be taken both symbolically, i.e., the struggle between the good, represented by the cats, and evil, represented by the mice. It could also detail a common actual problem in monasteries of keeping the host wafers safe from rodents. At this point, I think it would be good to end our discussion. We've looked at the art of the Franks, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, the Hiberno-Saxons, and noted their reliance on complex, interwoven forms. Most importantly, we've been introduced into a new approach to image making that has integrated itself into Christianity. In our next lecture, I'd like to discuss that integration further with the first great empire to emerge in the Middle Ages, the Carolingian Empire, and its ruler Charlemagne. Until then, keep an eye on art, and thank you very much.